My psychology teacher made me believe I was special by constantly praising me, but she was actually conducting an illegal experiment on our entire class, using me as bait to trigger bullying. And when I found out, I destroyed her life, just like she destroyed mine. I've always been the quiet type in school. Not invisible exactly, but definitely not the kind of person who draws attention. I preferred sitting in the back corner, finishing my assignments early, and keeping my head down. That was my survival strategy for getting through high school without drama. And it worked perfectly fine until I walked into Miss Rodriguez's psychology class during my junior year. From day one, something felt different about her approach. While other teachers barely noticed me, Miss Rodriguez seemed fascinated by everything I did. She would call on me constantly, even when I didn't raise my hand. She praised my answers in front of the entire class, often comparing my responses to other students. When Sarah gave a decent answer about behavioral conditioning, Miss Rodriguez would say something like, "That's good, Sarah, but notice how Alex always provides such detailed psychological insights." At first, I felt incredible. For the first time in my life, a teacher was recognizing my intelligence publicly. My parents had always told me I was smart, but having an adult authority figure validate that in front of my peers felt amazing. I started participating more, raising my hand eagerly, staying after class to discuss complex psychological theories. Miss Rodriguez encouraged this behavior, telling me I had a natural gift for understanding human psychology. But I began noticing changes in how my classmates treated me. Kids who used to ignore me completely started shooting me dirty looks. During group projects, no one wanted to be partnered with me. In the hallways, I'd catch whispers and see pointing. At lunch, the few acquaintances I had started avoiding my table. I couldn't understand what I'd done wrong. When I mentioned this to Miss Rodriguez during one of our after-class conversations, she nodded sympathetically and told me that intelligent students often face jealousy from their peers. She explained that my classmates were simply intimidated by my superior understanding of psychology, and that this kind of social rejection was normal for gifted students. She advised me to ignore their behavior and continue excelling, assuring me that their resentment would eventually fade. The praise continued escalating. Miss Rodriguez started assigning me special research projects that no other student received. She would have me present these projects to the class, highlighting my work as exemplary. During parent-teacher conferences, she reportedly told my parents that I was the most promising psychology student she'd encountered in her 15-year teaching career. She even suggested I consider pursuing psychology in college, offering to write recommendation letters and connect me with professors at local universities. My social situation, however, continued deteriorating. The hostile answers turned into verbal comments. Students would mutter, "teacher's pet," or "show off," when I walked past. During group discussions, my contributions were met with eye rolls and dismissive comments. One day, Jake Morrison told me to stop trying so hard to impress the teacher because everyone found it annoying. When I tried explaining that I genuinely enjoyed the subject matter, he laughed and said no one believed my innocent act. The bullying escalated beyond verbal harassment. Someone started leaving nasty notes in my locker, calling me a brown-noser and worse. During lunch, groups of students would deliberately bump into me while walking past my table. My backpack was mysteriously knocked over multiple times, spilling my books across the hallway floor. Once, I found my psychology textbook in a bathroom trash can, soaked with water. I was confused and hurt by this treatment. I'd never been popular, but I'd never been actively targeted either. When I brought these incidents to Miss Rodriguez's attention, she expressed concern and sympathy. She told me she'd speak to the administration about implementing anti-bullying measures. She also reassured me that exceptional students throughout history had faced similar persecution, citing examples of famous psychologists who were misunderstood by their contemporaries. Ms. Rodriguez suggested we meet weekly to discuss my progress and provide emotional support during this difficult period. During these sessions, she'd ask detailed questions about specific incidents with my classmates. She wanted to know exactly what they said, how they said it, and how their behavior made me feel. She encouraged me to document these interactions in a journal, claiming it would help me process the emotional impact and potentially serve as evidence if we needed to involve school administrators. What I didn't realize at the time was how carefully she was orchestrating everything. Miss Rodriguez would deliberately call on me immediately after less prepared students gave weak answers, making the contrast more obvious and embarrassing for them. She would assign group projects where I was paired with students who clearly disliked me, then publicly praise my contributions while subtly criticizing my partner's efforts. During class discussions, she'd redirect conversations to topics she knew I'd researched extensively, allowing me to dominate the discussion while others sat silently. The situation reached a breaking point when someone spray painted "psychology freak" on my locker in bright red letters. The incident occurred overnight, and by morning, practically the entire school had seen it. Students gathered around taking pictures and laughing. I felt humiliated and genuinely feared for my safety. The maintenance crew cleaned it off, but the image was already circulating on social media. Ms. Rodriguez found me crying in an empty classroom that afternoon. She expressed outrage about the vandalism and promised to help me identify the perpetrators. She suggested installing security cameras near my locker and recommended I start parking in a different location to avoid potential vehicle damage. Her concern seemed genuine, and I felt grateful to have at least one adult on my side. That evening, she called my parents to discuss the escalating harassment. She explained that I was experiencing severe social persecution due to my academic excellence, and suggested my family consider transferring me to a different school where my talents would be better appreciated. She painted a picture of me as a victim of systematic academic jealousy, recommending counseling to help me cope with the emotional trauma. But everything changed 3 weeks later during a completely accidental discovery that shattered my entire understanding of the situation. I'd stayed late after school to work on a research project in the library. Around 5:30 p.m., I realized I'd left my psychology notebook in Miss Rodriguez's classroom and needed it to complete my assignment. The main building was mostly empty, with only a few teachers remaining for evening meetings. I walked quietly through the hallways, not wanting to draw attention to myself. As I approached Miss Rodriguez's classroom, I heard voices coming from inside. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Miss Rodriguez talking with 2 other teachers I didn't recognize. They appeared to be having some kind of official meeting, with papers spread across her desk and recording equipment set up on a side table. I was about to knock and ask for my notebook when I heard Miss Rodriguez mention my name. Something in her tone made me pause and listen more carefully. What I heard next completely destroyed everything I thought I knew about my situation. Miss Rodriguez was explaining to the other teachers how she'd successfully created a controlled social experiment in her classroom. She described how she deliberately elevated one student to create tension and observe the resulting group dynamics. She was documenting behavioral patterns, recording classroom interactions, and analyzing the psychological responses of both the targeted student and the peer group. I stood frozen in the hallway as she detailed her methodology. She explained how she'd chosen me specifically because I was intelligent but socially awkward, making me an ideal subject for studying social isolation and academic jealousy. She'd systematically praised me while subtly undermining other students, creating an environment where resentment toward me would naturally develop. The other teachers were asking questions about her data collection methods. Miss Rodriguez showed them video recordings she'd made of classroom interactions, including close-ups of students' facial expressions during my presentations. She had charts tracking the escalation of hostile behaviors toward me over time. She documented every incident I'd reported to her, using my emotional responses as data points for her research. She bragged about how effectively she'd manipulated the social dynamics, describing her technique as environmental conditioning. She'd created the perfect scenario for studying adolescent pack mentality and academic ostracism. She mentioned submitting her findings to psychology journals and using this research for her doctoral dissertation. But The most devastating revelation came when one of the other teachers asked about the ethical implications of experimenting on minors without consent. Miss Rodriguez laughed and said that technically, she wasn't harming anyone, just observing natural social behaviors that would have occurred eventually anyway. She claimed she was actually providing valuable insights into teenage psychology that could benefit future educational approaches. The other teacher pressed further, asking about my emotional well-being during this experiment. Miss Rodriguez dismissed these concerns, stating that I was resilient and that experiencing adversity would ultimately make me stronger. She described my distress as valuable, authentic data and mentioned how my trust in her had allowed her to gather detailed information about the victim's perspective that other researchers couldn't access. I felt physically sick listening to this conversation. Everything I'd trusted, every moment of validation and support, had been carefully calculated manipulation. My teacher hadn't been protecting me from bullying. She'd been creating it systematically and using my suffering as research material for her personal academic advancement. I quietly backed away from the classroom and spent the next hour sitting in my car in the parking lot, trying to process what I'd learned. The betrayal felt worse than all the bullying combined. At least my classmates' hostility was honest. Miss Rodriguez had gained my trust, positioning herself as my only ally while secretly orchestrating my social destruction. That night, I couldn't sleep or eat. Every interaction with Miss Rodriguez replayed in my mind with this new context. Her concerned questions about my emotional state, her requests for detailed descriptions of bullying incidents, her encouragement to document everything in a journal, all of it was just data collection for her experiment. The next morning, I decided I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. During psychology class, I sat in my usual front row seat and watched Miss Rodriguez with completely different eyes. When she called on me to answer a question about social learning theory, I gave a minimal response instead of my usual detailed analysis. When she tried to praise my answer and encourage elaboration, I simply said I was tired and didn't feel like discussing it further. After class, Miss Rodriguez approached me with fake concern, asking if everything was all right. She noticed I seemed distressed and wondered if the bullying situation was affecting my academic performance. She offered to schedule an additional counseling session to help me work through whatever was troubling me. I looked at her directly and told her I was fine, just reassessing some things about trust and manipulation in social relationships. Her expression flickered slightly, but she maintained her concerned facade. She reminded me that her door was always open if I needed support, and that she was committed to helping me succeed despite the challenges I was facing from my peers. Over the next few days, I quietly began developing a plan. I knew I needed concrete evidence of her experiment before making any accusations. I started paying closer attention to her teaching methods, taking notes about her manipulation techniques during class. I began recording our private conversations using my phone, hoping to capture her admitting to the experiment. I also reached out to some of my classmates, approaching the situation carefully. I started with students who seemed less hostile toward me, asking general questions about their perceptions of Miss Rodriguez's teaching style. Several of them mentioned feeling like she deliberately embarrassed them while praising me. They described feeling manipulated and frustrated by her obvious favoritism. Sarah, who'd always been relatively neutral toward me, admitted she'd started resenting me specifically because of how Miss Rodriguez constantly compared us. She said it felt like no matter how hard she tried, the teacher would always highlight how much better my responses were. She'd begun to hate psychology class and was considering dropping it entirely. Jake Morrison, who'd been one of my most vocal critics, surprisingly opened up when I approached him privately. He explained that he'd never disliked me personally, but felt angry about the obvious unfairness in how Miss Rodriguez treated different students. He said watching her consistently praise me while dismissing others made him want to take his frustration out on me, even though he knew it wasn't really my fault. These conversations revealed that my classmates weren't naturally jealous or hostile people. They were responding exactly as Miss Rodriguez had intended, reacting to the deliberately unfair treatment she'd created in our classroom environment. They were victims of her manipulation just as much as I was. 2 weeks after my discovery, I finally got the evidence I needed. During one of our weekly counseling sessions, I managed to record Miss Thierry Rodriguez explaining her theories about social hierarchy in adolescent groups. She described how creating artificial elevation of one student could trigger predictable behavioral responses from the peer group, and mentioned how valuable the data from our class had been for her research. When I pressed her about the ethics of observing student suffering without intervention, she defended her methods by claiming that she was studying natural phenomena that would occur regardless of her involvement. She insisted that her research would ultimately benefit education by providing insights into teenage social dynamics. Armed with this recording and my detailed notes about her manipulation techniques, I scheduled a meeting with our school principal, Mr. Henderson. I brought my parents for support and presented all the evidence I'd gathered about Ms. Rodriguez's unauthorized psychological experiment. Mr. Henderson was initially skeptical, suggesting that perhaps I'd misunderstood Ms. Rodriguez's intentions or taken her academic discussions out of context. But when I played the recorded conversation, where she explicitly described treating students as research subjects, his expression became very serious. The principal immediately launched an investigation, interviewing other students in my psychology class and reviewing Ms. Rodriguez's lesson plans and teaching materials. They discovered that she'd been recording classroom interactions without proper authorization and had been collecting personal information about students under the guise of academic mentoring. When confronted with the evidence, Ms. Rodriguez initially tried to defend her actions as innovative teaching methods designed to help students understand psychological principles through first-hand experience. She claimed that observing real social dynamics was more educational than theoretical discussions about psychology. But the school board didn't see it that way. They determined that she'd violated multiple professional ethics guidelines by experimenting on minors without consent, creating hostile educational environments, and prioritizing her personal research over student welfare. The unauthorized recording of students was particularly problematic from both legal and ethical standpoints. Ms. Rodriguez was immediately suspended pending a full investigation. Within 2 weeks, she was permanently terminated from her position. The school board also reported her conduct to the state licensing board, which revoked her teaching certificate. Her doctoral dissertation research was deemed invalid due to ethical violations, and she was expelled from her graduate program. The revelation about Ms. Rodriguez's experiment completely changed the social dynamics in our psychology class. When students learned that their hostility toward me had been artificially manufactured through her manipulation, many of them apologized for their behavior. They realized they'd been used as unwitting participants in an unethical psychological study. Sarah approached me after the news broke and expressed genuine remorse for how she'd treated me. She explained that learning about the manipulation made her feel violated and angry, but also helped her understand why she'd felt such strong negative emotions toward me despite having no real personal conflict. Jake Morrison actually became an ally, helping me document additional instances of Miss Rodriguez's manipulative behavior that I'd missed. He was furious about being manipulated into bullying someone and wanted to ensure she faced maximum consequences for her actions. The substitute teacher who took over our psychology class spent several sessions helping students process what had happened to us. She explained how we'd all been victims of psychological manipulation and helped us understand that our responses had been normal reactions to an artificially created hostile environment. My parents were horrified when they learned the full extent of what had occurred. They'd completely trusted Ms. Rodriguez and had even been grateful for her apparent support during my bullying situation. Learning that she'd been the architect of my suffering while positioning herself as my protector felt like an enormous betrayal of their trust as well. The school implemented new policies requiring explicit consent for any classroom activities that could be considered psychological research. They also established clearer guidelines about recording students and collecting personal information, ensuring that what happened to our class couldn't happen to future students. Miss Rodriguez attempted to contact me several times after her termination, leaving voicemails claiming that I'd misunderstood her intentions and destroyed her career over a simple miscommunication. She insisted that her research would have benefited countless students and that my actions had prevented important scientific discoveries. I never responded to her messages. Her continued attempts to justify experimenting on unwilling minors only confirmed that she felt no genuine remorse for the psychological harm she'd caused. She seemed more concerned about her ruined career than the students she'd manipulated and traumatized. The experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, manipulation, and standing up for myself when authority figures abuse their power. It also helped me understand how easily social dynamics can be artificially created and manipulated by people in positions of influence. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the people who claim to be helping you are actually the ones causing your problems. Miss Rodriguez had positioned herself as my protector and ally, while secretly orchestrating my social destruction for her personal gain. Looking back, I'm glad I discovered the truth and took action to stop her unethical behavior. She was planning to continue her experiments with future classes, potentially harming many more students in pursuit of her academic goals. By exposing her actions, I prevented other kids from experiencing the psychological manipulation and social isolation that she deliberately created in our classroom. The situation also brought my classmates and me closer together. Shared experiences of being manipulated created bonds between us that might never have formed otherwise. We'd all learned important lessons about recognizing manipulation and supporting each other against adults who abuse their authority. My advice to anyone who suspects they're being manipulated by a teacher or authority figure is to trust their instincts and seek evidence before confronting the situation. Document everything. Talk to other people who might be affected, and don't hesitate to involve parents or administrators when you have proof of misconduct. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we trust completely. But that doesn't mean we should stop trusting everyone. It means we should learn to recognize the warning signs of manipulation and protect ourselves accordingly. As we wrap up today's story, remember that Viral Family Tales brings you a new story every single day, so make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. If this story resonated with you, or if you've experienced something similar, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you, and your engagement helps us continue creating content that matters. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about standing up to authority figures who abuse their power. Thank you for being part of the Viral Family Tales community.